The Story of a Lie. Chapter 1 introduces the Admiral. When Dick Nasby was in Paris, he made some odd acquaintances, for he was one of those who have ears to hear, and can use their eyes no less than their intelligence. He made as many thoughts as Stuart Mill, but his philosophy concerned flesh and blood, and was experimental as to its method. He was a type hunter among mankind. He despised small game and insignificant personalities, whether in the shape of dukes or bagmen, letting them go by like seaweed, but show him a refined or powerful face. Let him hear a plangent or a penetrating voice. Fish for him with a living look in someone's eye, a passionate gesture, a meaning and ambiguous smile, and his mind was instantaneously awakened. There was a man, there was a woman, he seemed to say, and he stood up to the task of comprehension with the delight of an artist in his art. And indeed, rightly considered, this interest of his was an artistic interest. There is no science in the personal study of human nature. All comprehension is creation. The woman I love is somewhat of my handiwork, and the great lover, like the great painter, is he that can so embellish his subject as to make her more than human, whilst yet by a cunning art he has so based his apotheosis on the nature of the case that the woman can go on being a true woman, and give her character free play, and show littleness or cherish spite, or be greedy of common pleasures, and he continue to worship without a thought of incongruity. To love a character is only the heroic way of understanding it. When we love by some noble method of our own or some nobility of mien or nature in the other, we apprehend the loved one by what is noblest in ourselves. When we are merely studying an eccentricity, the method of our study is but a series of allowances. To begin to understand is to begin to sympathize, for comprehension comes only when we have stated another's faults and virtues in terms of our own. Hence the proverbial toleration of artists for their own evil creations. Hence, too, it came about that Dick Nasby, a high-minded creature, and as scrupulous and brave a gentleman as you would want to meet, held in a sort of affection the various human creeping things whom he had met and studied. One of these was Mr. Peter Van Tromp, an English-speaking, two-legged animal of the international genus, and by profession of general and more than equivocal utility. Years before he had been a painter of some standing in a colony, and portraits signed Van Tromp had trumped the greatness of colonial governors and judges. In those days he had been married, and driven his wife and infant daughter in a pony trap. What were the steps of his declension? No one exactly knew. Here was at least, and had been any time these past 10 years, a sort of dismal parasite upon the foreigner in Paris. It would be hazardous to specify his exact industry. Coarsely followed, it would have merited a name grown somewhat unfamiliar to our ears. Followed as he followed it, with a skillful reticence, in a kind of social chiaroscuro, it was still possible for the polite to call him a professional painter. His lair was in the Grand Hotel and the gaudiest cafes. There he might be seen jotting off a sketch with an air of some inspiration, and he was always affable, and one of the easiest of men to fall in talk with. The conversation usually ripened into a peculiar sort of intimacy, and it was extraordinary how many little services Van Tromp contrived to render in the course of 36 hours. He occupied a position between a friend and a courier, which made him worse than embarrassing to repay. But those whom he obliged could always buy one of his villainous little pictures, or, where the favours had been prolonged and more than usually delicate, might order and pay for a large canvas, with perfect certainty that they would hear no more of the transaction. Among resident artists he enjoyed celebrity of a non-professional sort. He had spent more money, no less than 3 individual fortunes, it was whispered, than any of his associates could ever hope to gain. Apart from his colonial career, he had been to Greece in a brigantine with 4 brass carronades, he had travelled Europe in a chaise and 4, drawing bridle at the palace doors of German princes. Queens of song and dance had followed him like sheep and paid his tailor's bills. And to behold him now, seeking small loans with plaintive condescension, sponging for breakfast on an art student of 19, a fallen Don Juan who had neglected to die at the propitious hour, had a colour of romance for young imaginations. His name and his bright past, seen through the prism of whispered gossip, had gained him the nickname of the Admiral. Dick found him one day at the receipt of custom, rapidly painting a pair of hens and a cock in a little watercolour sketching box, and now and then glancing at the ceiling like a man who should seek inspiration from the muse. Dick thought it remarkable that a painter should choose to work over an absentee in a public cafe, and looked the man over. The aged rakishness of his appearance was set off by a youthful costume. He had disreputable grey hair and a disreputable sore, red nose, but the coat and the gesture, the outworks of the man, were still designed for show. Dick came up to his table and inquired if he might look at what the gentleman was doing. No one was so delighted as the Admiral. "A bit of a thing," said he. "I just dashed them off like that. I dashed them off," he added with a gesture. "Quite so," said Dick, who was appalled by the feebleness of the production. "Understand me," continued Van Tromp, "I am a man of the world, and yet once an artist, always an artist. All of a sudden a thought takes me in the street, I become its prey. It's like a pretty woman, no use to struggle, I must dash it off." "I see," said Dick. "Yes," pursued the painter, "it all comes easily to me. It is not my business, it's a pleasure. Life is my business, life, this great city, Paris, Paris after dark, its lights, its gardens, its odd corners. Aha!" he cried, "to be young again. The heart is young, but the heels are leaden. A poor, mean business to grow old. Nothing remains but the coup d'oeil, the contemplative man's enjoyment, mister," and he paused for the name. "Nasby," returned Dick. The other treated him at once to an exciting beverage, and expatiated on the pleasure of meeting a compatriot in a foreign land. To hear him, you would have thought they had encountered in Central Africa. Dick had never found anyone take a fancy him so readily, nor show it in an easier or less offensive manner. She seemed tickled with him as an elderly fellow about town might be tickled by a pleasant and witty lad. He indicated that he was no precisian, but in his wildest times had never been such a blade as he thought Dick. Dick protested, but in vain. This manner of carrying an intimacy at the bayonet's point was Van Tromp's stock in trade. With an older man he insinuated himself, with youth he imposed himself, and in the same breath imposed an ideal on his victim, who saw that he must work up to it or lose the esteem of this old and vicious patron. And what young man can bear to lose a character for vice? At last, as it grew towards dinner time, "Do you know Paris?" asked Van Tromp. "For not so well as you, I am convinced," said Dick. "And so am I," returned Van Tromp gaily. "Paris, my young friend, you will allow me, when you know Paris as I do, you will have seen strange things. I say no more, all I say is, strange things, for we are men of the world, you and I. And in Paris, in the heart of civilized existence, this is an opportunity, Mr. Naseby. Let us dine. Let me show you where to dine." Dick consented. On the way to dinner, the Admiral showed him where to buy gloves and made him buy them, where to buy cigars and made him buy a vast store, some of which he obligingly accepted. To the restaurant he showed him what to order, with surprising consequences in the bill. What he made that night by his percentages it would be hard to estimate. And all the while Dick smilingly consented, understanding well that he was being done, but taking his losses in the pursuit of character as a hunter sacrifices his dogs. As for the strange things, the reader will be relieved to hear that they were no stranger than might have been expected, and he may find things quite as strange without the expense of a Van Tromp for guide. Yet he was a guide of no mean order, who made up for the poverty of what he had to show by a copious imaginative commentary. "And such," said he, with a hiccup, "such is Paris." "Pooh," said Dick, who was tired of the performance. The Admiral hung an ear, and looked up sidelong with a glimmer of suspicion. "Good night," said Dick. "I'm tired." "So English," cried Van Tromp, clutching him by the hand. "So English. So Blaise. Such a charming companion. Let me see you home." "Look here," returned Dick. "I have said good night, now I'm going. You're an amusing old boy, I like you, in a sense, but here's an end of it for tonight. Not another cigar, not another grog, not another percentage out of me." "I beg your pardon," cried the Admiral with dignity. "Tut, man," said Dick. "You're not offended. You're a man of the world, I thought. I've been studying you, and it's over. Have I not paid for the lesson? Au revoir." Van Tromp laughed gaily, shook hands up to the elbows, hoped cordially they would meet again, and that often, but looked after Dick as he departed with a tremor of indignation. After that they too not unfrequently fell in each other's way, and Dick would often treat the old boy to breakfast on a moderate scale, and in a restaurant of his own selection. Often, too, he would lend Van Tromp the matter of £1, in view of that gentleman's contemplated departure for Australia. There would be a scene of farewell almost touching in character, and a week or a month later they would meet on the same boulevard without surprise or embarrassment. And in the meantime Dick learned more about his icons on all sides, heard of his yacht, his chase and four, his brief season of celebrity amid a more confiding population, his daughter, of whom he loved to whimper in his cups, his sponging, parasitical, nameless way of life, and with each new detail something that was not merely interest nor yet altogether to groove in his mind towards this disreputable stepson of the arts. Ere he left Paris, Van Tromp was one of those whom he entertained to a farewell supper, and the old gentleman made the speech of the evening, and then fell below the table, weeping, smiling, paralyzed. Chapter 2. A Letter to You the Papers. Old Mr. Naseby had the sturdy, untutored nature of the upper middle class. The universe seemed plain to him. The thing's right, he would say, or the thing's wrong. And there was an end of it. There was a contained, prophetic energy in his utterances. Even on the slightest affairs, he saw the damned thing. If he did not, it must be from perversity of will, and this sent the blood to his head. Apart from this, which made him an exacting companion, he was one of the most upright, hot-tempered, hot-headed old gentlemen in England. Florid, with white hair, the face of an old Jupiter, and the figure of an old fox-hunter, he enlivened the Vale of Thine from end to end on his big, cantering chestnut. He had a hearty respect for Dick as a lad of parts. Dick had a respect for his father as the best of men, tempered by the politic revolt of a youth who has to see to his own independence. Whenever the pair argued, they came to an open rupture, and arguments were frequent, for they were both positive, and both loved the work of the intelligence. It was a treat to hear Mr. Naseby defending the Church of England in a volley of oaths, or supporting ascetic morals with an enthusiasm not entirely innocent of port wine. Dick used to wax indignant, and none the less so because, as his father was a skillful disputant, he found himself not seldom in the wrong. On these occasions he would redouble in energy, and declare that black was white, and blue yellow with much conviction and heat of manner, but in the morning such a license of debate weighed upon him like a crime, and he would seek out his father, where he walked before breakfast on a terrace overlooking all the Vale of Thyme. "I have to apologize, sir, for last night," he would begin. "Of course you have," the old gentleman would cut in cheerfully. "You spoke like a fool. Say no more about it." You do not understand me, sir. I refer to a particular point. I confess there is much force in your argument from the doctrine of possibilities." "Of course there is," returned his father. "Come down and look at the stables." Only he would add, "Bear this in mind, and do remember that a man of my age and experience knows more about what he is saying than a raw boy." He would utter the word boy even more offensively than the average of fathers, and the light way in which he accepted these apologies cut Richard to the heart. The latter drew slighting comparisons, and remembered that he was the only one who ever apologized. This gave him a high station in his own esteem, and thus contributed indirectly to his better behavior, for he was scrupulous as well as high-spirited, and prided himself on nothing more than on a just submission. So things went on until the famous occasion when Mr. Naseby, becoming engrossed in securing the election of a sound party candidate to Parliament, wrote a flaming letter to the papers. The letter had about every demerit of party letters in general. It was expressed with the energy of a believer. It was personal. It was a little more than half unfair, and about a quarter untrue. The old man did not mean to say what was untrue, you may be sure, but he had rashly picked up gossip, as his prejudice suggested, and now rashly launched it on the public with the sanction of his name. The Liberal candidate, he concluded, is thus a public turncoat. Is that the sort of man we want? He has been given the lie and has swallowed the insult. Is that the sort of man we want? I answer no. With all the force of my conviction, I answer no. And then he signed and dated the letter with an amateur's pride, and looked to be famous by the morrow. Dick, who had heard nothing of the matter, was up first on that inauspicious day, and took the journal to an arbour in the garden. He found his father's manifesto in one column, and in another a leading article. No one that we are aware of ran the article, had consulted Mr. Naseby on the subject, but if he had been appealed to by the whole body of electors, his letter would be none the less ungenerous and unjust to Mr. Dalton. We do not choose to give the lie to Mr. Naseby, for we are too well aware of the consequences, but we shall venture instead to print the facts of both cases referred to by this partisan in another portion of our issue. Mr. Naseby is of course a large proprietor in our neighbourhood, but fidelity to facts, decent feeling and English grammar, are all of them qualities more important than the possession of land. Mr. is doubtless a great man. In his large gardens and that half-mile of greenhouses, where he has probably ripened his intellect and temper, he may say what he will to his hired vassals, but, as the Scotch say, here, he mauna think to domineer. Liberalism, continued anonymous journalist, is of too free and sound a growth, etc. Richard Naseby read the whole thing from beginning to end, and a crushing shame fell upon his spirit. His father had played the fool, he had gone out noisily to war, and come back with confusion. The moment that his trumpet sounded, he had been disgracefully unhorsed. There was no question as to the facts, they were one and all against the squire. Richard would have given his ears to have suppressed the issue, but as that could not be done, he had his horse saddled, and furnishing himself with a convenient staff, rode off at once to Thynbury. The editor was at breakfast in a large, sad apartment. The absence of furniture, the extreme meanness of the meal, and the haggard, bright-eyed, consumptive look of the culprit, unmanned our hero, but he clung to his stick, and was stout and warlike. "You wrote the article in this morning's paper?" he demanded. "You are young Mr. Naseby?" "I published it," replied the editor, rising. "For my father is an old man," said Richard, and then with an outburst, "and a damned sight finer fellow than either you or Dalton." She stopped and swallowed. He was determined that all should go with regularity. "So I have but one question to put to you, sir," he resumed. "Granted that my father was misinformed, would it not have been more decent to withhold the letter and communicate with him in private?" "Believe me," returned the editor, "that alternative was not open to me. Mr. Naseby told me in a note that he had sent his letter to 3 other journals, and in fact threatened me with what he called exposure, if I kept it back from mine. I am really concerned at what has happened. I sympathize and approve of your emotion, young gentleman, But the attack on Mr. Dalton was gross, very gross, and I had no choice but to offer him my columns to reply. Party has its duties, sir, added the scribe, kindling, as one who should propose a sentiment, and the attack was gross. Richard stood for half a minute digesting the answer, and then the god of fair play came uppermost in his heart, and murmuring good morning, he made his escape into the street. His horse was not hurried on the way home, and he was late for breakfast. The squire was standing with his back to the fire in a state bordering on apoplexy, his fingers violently knitted under his coat-tails. As Richard came in, he opened and shut his mouth like a codfish, and his eyes protruded. "Have you seen that, sir?" he cried, nodding towards the paper. "Yes, sir," said Richard. "Oh, you've read it. Have you?" "Yes, I have read it," replied Richard, looking at his foot. "Well," demanded the old gentleman, "and what have you to say to it, sir?" "You seem to have been misinformed," said Dick. "Well, what then? Is your mind so sterile, sir? Have you not a word of comment? No proposal?" "I fear, sir, you must apologize to Mr. Dalton. It would be more handsome. Indeed, it would be only just, and a free acknowledgement would go far." Richard paused, no language appearing delicate enough to suit the case. "That is a suggestion which should have come from me, sir," roared the father. "It is out of place upon your lips. It is not the thought of a loyal son. Why, sir, if my father had been plunged in such deplorable circumstances, I should have thrashed the editor of that vile sheet within an inch of his life. I should have thrashed the man, sir. It would have been the action of an ass, but it would have shown that I had the blood and the natural affections of a man." "Son? You are no son of mine, sir?" "Sir," said Dick. "I'll tell you what you are, sir," pursued the squire. "You're a Benthamite. I disown you. Your mother would have died for shame. There was no modern cant about your mother. She thought she said to me, 'So I'm glad she's in her grave.' Dick Nasby, misinformed." "Misinformed, sir? Have you no loyalty, no spring, no natural affections? What are you, clockwork, eh? Away, this is no place for you. Away," waving his hands in the air. "Go away. Leave me." At this moment Dick beat a retreat in a disarray of nerves, a whistling and clamour of his own arteries, and in short in such a final bodily disorder as made him alike incapable of speech or hearing. And in the midst of all this turmoil, a sense of unpardonable injustice remained graven in his memory. Chapter 3. In the Admiral's name. There was no return to the subject. Dick and his father were henceforth on terms of coldness. The upright old gentleman grew more upright when he met his son, buckrammed with immortal anger. He asked after Dick's health, and discussed the weather and the crops with an appalling courtesy. His pronunciation was point device. His voice was distant, distinct, and sometimes almost trembling with suppressed indignation. As for Dick, it seemed to him as if his life had come abruptly to an end. He came out of his theories and clevernesses. His premature man of the worldness, on which he had prided himself on his travels, shrank like a thing ashamed before this real sorrow. Pride, wounded honor, pity and respect tussled together daily in his heart, and now he was within an ace of throwing himself upon his father's mercy, and now of slipping forth at night and coming back no more to Naseby House. He suffered from the sight of his father, nay, even from the neighborhood of this familiar valley, where every corner had its legend, and he was besieged with memories of childhood. If he fled into a new land, and among none but strangers, he might escape his destiny, who knew, and begin again light-heartedly. From that chief peak of the hills, that now and then, like an uplifted finger, shone in an arrow of sunlight through the broken clouds, the shepherd in clear weather might perceive the shining of the sea. There, he thought, was hope. But his heart failed him when he saw the squire, and he remained. His fate was not that of the voyager by sea and land. He was to travel in the spirit, and begin his journey sooner than he supposed. For it chanced one day that his walk led him into a portion of the uplands which was almost unknown to him. Scrambling through some rough woods, he came out upon a moorland reaching towards the hills. A few lofty Scotch firs grew hard by upon a knoll. A clear fountain near the foot of the knoll sent up a miniature streamlet which meandered in the heather. A shower had just skimmed by, but now the sun shone brightly, and the air smelt of the pines and the grass. On a stone under the trees sat a young lady sketching. We have learned to think of women in a sort of symbolic transfiguration, based on clothes, and one of the readiest ways in which we conceive our mistress is as a composite thing, principally petticoats. But humanity has triumphed over clothes. The touch of a dress has become alive, and the woman who stitched herself into these material integuments has now permeated right through and gone out to the tip of her skirt. It was only a black dress that caught Dick Naseby's eye, but it took possession of his mind, and all other thoughts departed. He drew near, and the girl turned round. Her face startled him. It was a face he wanted, and he took it in at once like breathing air. "I beg your pardon," he said, taking off his hat. "You are sketching." "Oh," she exclaimed, for my own amusement. "I despise the thing." 10 to 1, you do yourself injustice," returned Dick. Besides, it's a Freemasonry. I sketch myself. And you know what that implies. To know what, she asked. 2 things, he answered. First, that I am no very difficult critic, and second, that I have a right to see your picture. She covered the block with both her hands. Oh no, she said. I am ashamed. Indeed, I might give you a hint, said Dick. Although no artist myself, I have known many. In Paris I had many for friends, and used to prowl among studios. In Paris! She cried, with a leap of light into her eyes. Did you ever meet Mr. Van Tromp? I. Yes, why, you're not the Admiral's daughter, are you? The Admiral? Do they call him that? She cried. Oh, how nice of them. It is the younger men who call him so, is it not? Yes, said Dick, somewhat heavily. You can understand now, she said, with an unspeakable accent of contented, noble-minded pride, why it is I do not choose to show my sketch. Van Tromp's daughter. The Admiral's daughter. I delight in that name. The Admiral. And so you know my father? Well, said Dick, I met him often, we were even intimate. He may have mentioned my name, Naseby. He writes so little. He is so busy, so devoted to his art. I have had a half-wish, she added, laughing, that my father was a plainer man, whom I could help, to whom I could be a credit, but only sometimes, you know, and with only half my heart, for a great painter. You have seen his works? I have seen some of them, returned Dick. They are very nice. She laughed aloud. Nice? She repeated. I see you don't care much for art. Not much, he admitted, but I know that many people are glad to buy Mr. Van Tromp's pictures. Call him the Admiral, she cried. It sounds kindly and familiar, and I like to think that he is appreciated and looked up to by young painters. But he has not always been appreciated. He had a cruel life for many years, and when I think there were tears in her eyes when I think of that, I feel inclined to be a fool. She broke off. And now I shall go home. You have filled me full of happiness. For think, Mr. Naseby, I have not seen my father since I was 6 years old, and yet he is in my thoughts all day. You must come and call on me. My aunt will be delighted, I am sure, and then you will tell me all about my father, will you not? Dick helped her to get her sketching traps together, and when all was ready she gave Dick her hand and a frank return of pressure. You are my father's friend, she said. We shall be great friends too. You must come and see me soon. Then she was gone down the hillside at a run, and Dick stood by himself in a state of some bewilderment and even distress. There were elements of laughter in the business, but the black dress, and the face that belonged to it, and the hand that he had held in his, inclined him to a serious view. What was he, under the circumstances, called upon to do? Perhaps to avoid the girl. Well, he would think about that. Perhaps to break the truth to her. Why, 10 to 1. Such was her infatuation, he would fail. Perhaps to keep up the illusion, to colour the raw facts, to help her to false ideas, while yet not plainly stating falsehoods. Well, he would see about that. He would also see about avoiding the girl. He saw about this last so well, that the next afternoon beheld him on his way to visit her. In the meantime the girl had gone straight home, light as a bird, tremulous with joy, to the little cottage where she lived alone with a maiden aunt, and to that lady, a grim, 60-years-old Scotchwoman, with a nodding head, communicated news of her encounter and invitation. A friend of his? Cried the aunt. What like is he? What did ye say was his name? She was dead silent, and stared at the old woman darkling. Then very slowly, I said he was my father's friend. I have invited him to my house, and come he shall, she said, and with that she walked off to her room, where she sat staring at the wall all the evening. Miss M. Glashon, for that was the aunt's name, read a large Bible in the kitchen with some of the joys of martyrdom. It was perhaps 3:30 when Dick presented himself, rather scrupulously dressed. Before the cottage door he knocked, and a voice bade him enter. The kitchen, which opened directly off the garden, was somewhat darkened by foliage, but he could see her as she approached from the far end to meet him. This second sight of her surprised him. Her strong black brows spoke of temper easily aroused and hard to quiet. Her mouth was small, nervous and weak. There was something dangerous and sulky underlying in her nature, much that was honest, compassionate, and even noble. My father's name, she said, has made you very welcome. She gave him her hand, with a sort of curtsy. It was a pretty greeting, although somewhat mannered, and Dick felt himself among the gods. And she led him through the kitchen to a parlour, and presented him to Miss Glashon. Esther, said the aunt, see and make Mr. Naseby his tea. And as soon as the girl was gone upon this hospitable intent, the old woman crossed the room and came quite near to Dick as if in menace. You know that man? She asked in an imperious whisper. Mr. Van Tromp, said Dick. Yes, I know him. Well, and what brings ye here? she said. I couldn't save the mother her that's dead but the bairn. She had a note in her voice that filled poor Dick with consternation. Man, she went on, what is it now? Is it money? My dear lady, said Dick, I think you misinterpret my position. I am young Mr. Naseby of Naseby House. My acquaintance with Mr. Van Tromp is really very slender. I am only afraid that Miss Van Tromp has exaggerated our intimacy in her own imagination. I know positively nothing of his private affairs, and do not care to know. I met him casually in Paris, that is all. Miss M. Glashan drew a long breath. In Paris, she said. Well, what do you think of him? What do ye think of him? She repeated, with a different scansion, as Richard, who had not much taste for such a question, kept her waiting for an answer. I found him a very agreeable companion, he said. Aye, said she, did ye? And how does he win his bread? Well, I fancy, he gasped, that Mr. Van Tromp has many generous friends. I'll warrant. She sneered, and before Dick could find more to say, she was gone from the room. Esther returned with the tea things and sat down. Now, she said cosily, tell me all about my father. He, stammered Dick. He is a very agreeable companion. I shall begin to think it is more than you are, Mr. Naseby, she said, with a laugh. I am his daughter, you forget. Begin at the beginning, and tell me all you have seen of him, all he said and all you answered. You must have met somewhere, begin with that. So with that he began, how he had found the Admiral painting in a cafe, how his art so possessed him that he could not wait till he got home to well to dash off his idea, how this in reply to a question. His idea consisted of a cock crowing and 2 hens eating corn, how he was fond of cocks and hens, how this did not lead him to neglect more ambitious forms of art, through how he had a picture in his studio of a Greek subject which was said to be remarkable from several points of view, how no one had seen it nor knew the precise site of the studio, in which it was being vigorously though secretly confected, how, in answer to a suggestion, this shyness was common to the Admiral Michelangelo and others, how they, Dick and Van Tromp, had struck up an acquaintance at once, and dined together that same night, how he, the Admiral, had once given money to a beggar, how he spoke with effusion of his little daughter, how he had once borrowed money to send her a doll, a trait worthy of Newton, she being then in her 19th year at least, how, if the doll never arrived, which it appeared it never did, the trait was only more characteristic of the highest order of creative intellect, how he was not beautiful, striking, yes, Dick would go so far, decidedly striking in appearance, how his boots were made to lace and his coat was black, and not cut away, a frock and so on by the yard. It was astonishing how few lies were necessary. After all, people exaggerated the difficulty of life. A little steering, just a touch of the rudder now and then, and with a willing listener there is no limit to the domain of equivocal speech. Sometimes Miss M. Glashan made a freezing sojourn in the parlour, and then the task seemed unaccountably more difficult, but to Esther, who was all eyes and ears, her face alight with interest, his stream of language flowed without break or stumble, and his mind was ever fertile in ingenious evasions, and what an afternoon it was for Esther. Ah, she said at last, it's good to hear all this. My aunt, you should know, is narrow and too religious. She cannot understand an artist's life. It does not frighten me, she added grandly. I am an artist's daughter. With that speech, Dick consoled himself for his imposture. She was not deceived so grossly after all. And then, if a fraud, was not the fraud piety itself? And what could be more obligatory than to keep alive in the heart of a daughter that filial trust and honour which, even although misplaced, became her like a jewel of the mind? There might be another thought, a shade of cowardice, a selfish desire to please. Poor Dick was merely human, and what would you have had him do?